Well, Super Bowl Sunday. Who are you hoping? Yeah, I can tell there's a great rounding. Nobody's fans, are they? No fans today? None of our teams were there? Are you going to watch? Yeah, of course, for sure, somebody said. Today we have the culmination of professional football and the Super Bowl between the Seattle Seahawks and the Denver Broncos. Will you be rooting for a team? Your team make it into the Super Bowl? You want to see if Peyton Manning can lead a different professional franchise to another Super Bowl championship, or will you just be watching for the commercials? I hear that Doritos has some good ones. Will you be hoping for a memorable halftime show? I'm trying to figure out how Bruno Mars and the Red Hot Chili Peppers will ever mix. That might be worth the price of admission. Maybe it's worth seeing. Are you going to be watching? Apparently we will be, in droves. Baseball is called America's pastime, but I'm not sure if it's not matched by football, at least the Super Bowl. Based on last year's statistics, we ate during the Super Bowl 1.25 billion chicken wings. I have chickens. That's a lot of chickens. 15,000 tons of chips. 27 million slices of pizza just from Domino's and Pizza Hut. I don't know how much untold gallons of Pepto-Bismol that all comes out to. Will you be watching for those commercials that we love to watch? They're $4 million for 30 seconds. The ad revenue last year was over $300 million for the Super Bowl just for ads. What wins games? Strong quarterbacks, formidable linemen, fleet of foot secondary defenders, capable wide receivers? Or is it something more on the sidelines? No, I don't mean those cheerleaders scantily clad. I mean a cunning and skillful coaching staff who can use your own team's strengths to exploit the weaknesses of the other team and score more touchdowns. What does it take to be victorious in life? What does it take to be victorious on the football field? Maybe it's something of all of that. Maybe you, like me, really don't care that much. If you are watching, all you just want to watch is to be entertained by massive gladiators or interesting commercials. American football. We're really one of the only cultures that has our form of football, known for brute force, cunning skill, strength and endurance, teamwork, and battle strategy. How odd, then, that we would have this high holy days in our culture occur on a Sunday that we get the set of readings that we do for today. I'm not going to address 1 Corinthians, the wisdom of the emptiness of the cross, but I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Sermon on the Mount in the section that we read today called the Beatitudes. The values of Matthew 5, 1 to 12 seem light years away from our cultural expectation of what happens on the football field and what teams rely on for success. Jesus directs our attention instead to another place: the weak, the powerless, the vulnerable. Think about some of the groups that he lifts up. You might want to look in your Bible, if it's in front of you in a chair, Matthew 5. He says the poor in spirit, referring either to humble people or to those who are broken, those who have lost their last hope, those who mourn, those who suffer the loss and feeling of emptiness that follows that particular loss, the meek, those who are gentle and unobtrusive, who refuse to use power over others to make things happen, the merciful, people who are willingly surrender their privileges or otherwise go out of their way to improve the well-being of other people, those who are persecuted, those who refuse to give up their quest for truth and virtuousness, even though it might result in negative experiences in this life. The meek, the impoverished, the weeping, the merciful, the willing to take a beating. Sounds like the Seahawks to me. Just kidding, I don't really care either way. Doesn't sound like football at all, does it? And certainly not Super Bowl champions or any successful team at all, whether that be the boardroom or the ball field. Those Jesus lifts up are uniquely blessed, and they tend to stay off society's radar. we seem to push them to the periphery. They're often kept out of public view. They possess little power. Most of us wouldn't aspire to join them, nor would we like to find ourselves labeled among them in their categories. And what is it that Jesus says about these people? He says that they're blessed. That's kind of a tough term, isn't it? Because it's a term that we don't really use very much in our culture, and when we do, we mean material things. We're so blessed to have X, Y, and Z. We don't usually mean a deeper understanding. Sometimes it's translated happiness or happy are those, but it's not really that cheery, rah-rah, happy, shallow sense of happiness that's being addressed. We might say that the blessed are unburdened or satisfied. But when Jesus names the categories of those who are unburdened or satisfied, it sounds like the exact opposite, that they are actually the ones who are burdened and unsatisfied and unsatisfactory, at least the way in which we often look at it. In fact, the ones he lists appear more as the needy, the harassed, the scorned, and Jesus declares them the opposite of those things. Once he gets to them, they're secure and complete, he says. They receive grand promises, don't they? They will be comforted. They will be given mercy. They will have intimacy with God, and so on. In Matthew's gospel, these are the first of Jesus' teaching. So this is like the first class of the year, if you will, if you're a teacher. And what do you want to do in that first class? You want to set the tone, right? You want to lay the foundation. You want to make sure the class knows what they're doing, what they're going to be getting in the future. And so you would lay out sort of your strongest teaching. And here Jesus lays out his foundation, his message, his priorities, who he's going to see and what's going to matter. And for most of us, it's kind of confusing. Christians have several ways of looking at this Sermon on the Mount. Some have taken them as ethical instructions, as if Jesus tells people to shape up and that we should live humbly. It's sort of the should understanding of it, that we should be merciful and that we should want to receive God's gifts because of it. But not very many of us want to sign up for those categories. Others see Jesus trying to expose where true contentment resides, not in self-preservation or striving for more, but ironically in humble embrace of simplicity, of humility, of suffering, of disadvantage. And I think both of those have their merit, but they still don't want me to sign up. Maybe what's happening here at the outset of Jesus' teaching ministry is this. Jesus is outlining who he intends to bless, those that society does not see, whether it was the first century or the 21st century. He's talking about the ones who will be made content and gratified by participating in Jesus' promises both now and in the future. The kind of people that are overlooked now and then. The kind of people who suffer from brokenness and grief. The kind of people who are taken advantage of by friends and strangers. The kind of people who are always coming out on the losing side, whether on the playing field or the boardroom, whether it's their economic well-being, their social respectability, or their physical health. Jesus announces he intends to invert the take-for-granted expectations about where happiness and achievement can be found. And if anything, the Sermon on the Mount is a challenge, not just simply to the world, but to us. Now, I haven't set up this illustration. It's just a happy acquaintance that we had the Super Bowl on this day, so I'm not really picking on football. I played football myself. I loved it. It was a great sport. Football uniquely offers an expression of society's collective obsession, though, with battle and violence and domination, doesn't it? Because that's what it's about. Before you stop listening, because I'm picking on your favorite sport, if it is your favorite sport, I think there are wonderful things in it. Athleticism, teamwork, you see all kinds of wonderful things. And yet the game's focus on sheer force and control are things that the mourners, that the meek, that the truly impoverished souls can hardly imagine ever being about. So this is quite a different list compared to the list we're going to have later when we see the stats of individual players and teams shown up on the screen. So the coincidence between this high holy days of our culture and these lessons gives us an opportunity to be challenged by Jesus to reorder our values, through his commitment to fill up the very people we often assume are destined for emptiness. It reminds us that the world is still infatuated by models of success and power and control and runaway wealth. Have you ever been a little curious about how we perceive wealth in our culture? About how you individually perceive wealth and how I individually perceive wealth and how it seems to just take over our lives. When we ask our confirmands oftentimes, what do you want to do when you grow up? More often than not, the group often says, be rich. That's a goal? Didn't realize that was a goal. But it happens. Here's what I mean. I did some Googling of how the economic impact is about the Super Bowl. Undoubtedly, they're going to pay a king's ransom for that 15 minutes of time in the halftime show for those two sets of artists. They can afford to do so because the Super Bowl is a huge, expensive business. If you want to attend the game, the average price of a ticket is over $4,000. I had no idea. If you want a full-service luxury suite for the game, they will begin in the neighborhood of $500,000. The average price of a home in the U.S. is under $430,000. You can buy a suite for 3 hours for more. The commissioner of baseball, I don't know what he earned. I didn't Google him. The commissioner of football earned a salary of $30 million in 1 year for doing his job. No wonder that the soda and the souvenir cup that you get costs an arm and a leg at the park. Somebody's got to pay for that. I don't imagine too many people in the city of Newark will be attending because a quarter of that population in that town is under the poverty level. This year, there's even more troubling news. Cheerleaders suing the league over wages that are below poverty line, suits by players. The news this week that the Super Bowl is the one moment in our culture that has the highest incidence of sex trafficking. It's just, news is getting better, isn't it? I wish I hadn't Googled it now that I did it. Whenever you talk about values, you get into slippery territory, don't you? If you've ever talked about values, or Terry writes about values in the paper, wow, talk about slippery stuff. I'm sure that some of you who are football fans aren't really happy in the fact that I've kind of taken on this one particular illustration. I thought about using Justin Bieber and his shenanigans, but that just seems so short-lived. So don't call me later in the afternoon when the game is on to complain about how I ruined the game, because I'm going to be watching it too. It is just an apt vehicle, though, to make a really profound point that our gospel's trying to make. So allow the illustration to fall away, if you will. And my point is simply this: Super Bowl and football aside, we live in an environment as Christians that too often trains us to look in the wrong places for the definitions of success and what it means to have a good life. We live in an environment that trains us to look in the wrong places for what is absolutely critical for our lives, for what's most important about who we are as human beings, let alone who we are as Christian people. The Sermon on the Mount is 2 chapters in Matthew's Gospel. We begin today with the opening 12 verses called the Beatitudes. It reminds us that God's rule for the world doesn't always match up with the world's idea of how it should be ruled. John Stott wrote a commentary on the book of Ephesians. He entitled God's New Society. God's New Society. I think that's what the Beatitudes could also be entitled. Sort of says it all, doesn't it? God has designed the Christian community, Stott says, to be an illustration of what human relationships were meant to be, that we would see one another, whether we were meek or broken or sorrowful or impoverished or whatever we tend to be, because eventually we'll all end up in one of those categories. And there is fellowship, he says, in this new society with God, and fellowship with each other. And the norm is the rule of mutual love. That's what we're to be about. There's peace and harmony and unity around that strange symbol of God's ultimate act of victory, the emptiness of the cross. When we leave the community of faith, the inspiration of worship and encouragement of fellowship, Stott says, we are deployed as representatives of Christ in the world. We are, in other words, an outpost for the kingdom. The Bible tries to tell us who we are. So does the world. If you don't understand that, watch TV and ask the question, who's it telling me I'm supposed to be? And what am I supposed to be about? And then maybe you won't find the Bible quite so boring when it tries to tell you that you are God's child and that you're here on purpose and that you are in and of yourself ultimately and infinitely loved, and that you don't need Botox or any other surgeries, you don't need a bigger bank account, you don't need more security, you don't need a bigger car, a better life, a blonder wife, whatever it is. God has a plan for you as you are right here, because the values of the kingdom are not external things. They're internal ones. Glenn Stosson says this, Jesus' climax at the end of the Beatitudes says exactly this: stand faithful and don't get blown about by the ideologies of this world. If we lose our distinction from the world's greed, its uncaring, its self-centeredness, its exclusivism, its unfaithfulness, its violence, then we have no purpose. We are God's new society. And the Sermon on the Mount is its core curriculum. And in this season of Epiphany, this season of ahas and dawning light, we're going to have some tough challenges from Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount over the next few weeks. But we have a God whose eye is keenly on the needy, on the mournful, on the outcast and the burdened. Categories that often aren't chosen by those who fit into them. Categories that if you live long enough, you will find yourself in. And it's good news indeed to know that we don't have an NFL God. We have a God whose eye is on the sparrow. We have a God whose eye is upon the marginalized and the needy. We have a God who climbs all the way down from heaven and plants himself on a cross for you and I, so that even in death, we are not alone. That the very power of God and the very victory of God is ours. And those are promises that you and I can count on. Amen.